My name is Bob Rich. I'm the Executive Director, and thank you so much for coming to our 16th Arctic Research Seminar Series presentation in Washington, D.C., where we're delighted to welcome Betsy Baker. ARCIS works to connect Arctic research across boundaries through communication, coordination, and collaboration, providing the essential and tangible infrastructure required for research to advance. We're a nonprofit consortium of organizations and individuals working together in support of inquiry, discovery, and understanding of this important region and informing sound decision-making. This seminar series is designed to provide unique access to some of the leading Arctic researchers and leaders for federal officials, members of the DC policy community, and the broader public interested in the changing Arctic. The ideas shared here represent the cutting edge of what we're exploring and learning up north, and also what it means for the U.S. and the rest of the world. For those of you in the room here, I encourage you to take a look at the ARCIS materials about membership and services we provide on the table outside. Afterwards, I'd be happy to discuss any questions you have and would love to hear how we can best help you to succeed. If you're online, you can access the information under the Documents tab. If you're in the room, you should have received a seminar evaluation, which we'd like you to return to the registration desk after the seminar. We're currently planning upcoming seminars and need your suggestions to help select the best possible speakers. Online, please fill out the survey, which will appear at the conclusion of the seminar today. Let me just fix the sound problem we seem to be having in the room. For those of you on Twitter, we encourage you to use the hashtag ArcIsWebinar to discuss the event. We're currently joined by more than 100 registered participants from throughout the U.S. in more than 11 states and several other countries as well. For those of you on the webinar, my colleagues are available to answer any questions you have about ARCIS or Arctic research and to forward to us here in D.C. any questions for Betsy. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing your questions into the questions pane of your attendee control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end. Whether you're here or online, I invite you each to become an ARCIS member. Currently, all types of organizations are eligible to become ARCIS members, including academic institutions, government agencies, corporations, and indigenous organizations. Also, any individual who shares our enthusiasm about the importance of Arctic research can become an ARCIS member as well. I invite you to join us. www.arcis.org. I'd like to acknowledge our partners in this seminar series, the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which enables us to use this excellent meeting space, and thank you to the Polar Research Board of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine for their assistance with registration. Of course, I want to thank the National Science Foundation's Division of Polar Programs for major financial support to ARCIS and enabling this seminar series. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Betsy Baker. I first met Betsy in connection with the Study of Environmental Arctic Change, or SEARCH, for which ARCIS is the project office. She's been a member of the SEARCH Science Steering Committee since 2015. She currently serves as the Executive Director of the North Pacific Research Board, which she'll tell you about today, which recommends marine research activities and supports a wide range of related research projects. Prior to coming to MPRB, Betsy has a distinguished resume, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can read that online, that brought her to Harvard, the University of Minnesota, an advisor to the Alaska Arctic Policy Commission, the Arctic Council, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and many more. She's currently a tenured professor at the University of Vermont Law School and affiliated with the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and the University of Washington. And I wonder how she does all of that without getting on an airplane. She's a member of the Polar Research Board of the National Academy of Sciences. Betsy holds a BA from Northwestern University and a law degree from the University of Michigan Law School and Christian Albrechts Universität in Germany. So, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming to the ARCIS DC Arctic Research Seminar Series Dr. Betsy Baker to tell us about marine research in the North Pacific, the changing landscape for fisheries, ecosystems, and science funding in Alaskan waters.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to everybody here in the room for joining us. I think there are many more people online. I'm told there are about 100 and plus that have signed up, so welcome to you, whatever time zone you are in. I appreciate ARCIS' invitation to be part of this series, which has a long and distinguished list going backward and looking forward to some of the upcoming programs. I encourage you to take a look at those. So Argus gives all of its speakers this standard template, and I will do my best to hew to the topic that they announced, which is changing landscape for fisheries and ecosystems in Alaskan waters. But also, as a director of a marine science funding agency in Anchorage, I will touch on the funding landscape for that research, and that will really be at the far end of the presentation, and I'm hoping that it will be somewhat interactive given your experiences with funding in recent months and years. But I will deviate somewhat from the announced topic in order to share with you some of the lessons learned this past week, which I've spent in Washington, D.C. Indeed, I spent much of it in this room. The first half of the week, I guess I should be moving along here, the picture, which you don't need to see since I'm standing in front of you. So with several other folks from Search and the larger Arctic research community, it was a knowledge exchange workshop sponsored by the Sea Ice Action Team of Search. And Bob mentioned Search. It's an organization many of you will know is the study of environmental Arctic change, and it's recently refocused its efforts for more targeted work, synthesizing research on sea ice, land ice, permafrost, and focusing on communicating your Arctic research to decision makers. I'll return to Search's work at the end of my remarks, but let me first turn to that knowledge exchange workshop, which was about the one concept you see on the screen, communication. And it may seem obvious, but I ask each of you to stop and think about how you use communication in your various roles. So I'm here to speak to you today in at least 3 capacities: as a professor of ocean, Arctic, and environmental law, as a member of the Arctic research community, and as the director of the North Pacific Research Board. In all 3 of those capacities, I had a lot to learn from the focus of this particular workshop, which was aimed at you, at me, at researchers studying Arctic change. It was run by the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting at the University of Rhode Island, and if you are not familiar with them, after that workshop, I would highly encourage you to visit their site and see the resources they have to offer. And a lesson for the workshop that's applicable to all 3 of my roles, professor, researcher, funding director, is the importance of a good story and of sharing some of your own experience with your audience. So with your indulgence, I will use the rest of my half hour or so, not only to tell you a few good stories, but to reflect on changes I've seen in what the Arctic research community cares about. And I'll do this from the perspective of a social scientist who's fortunate enough to have fallen in with another crowd, marine scientists. For those of you who are here or online to learn about fisheries and ecosystem research and NPRB, the North Pacific Research Board, I promise I will get there in about 7 or 8 minutes, but let me start first with a story. And I'll do that by returning to the title of my talk. But in order to tell my story a bit better, I'm going to change the date from what you saw on the first screen, which was 2017, to 2007. And I'd ask you to think about what's happened in the decade that has unfolded since then. What was happening in 2007 in Arctic research generally, in your career trajectory, in your own discipline, in your research funding? I would argue that in the past decade, both Arctic research generally and funders of Arctic marine research have become more interested and capable in conducting interdisciplinary and more integrated science, in doing ecosystem science better, and are more aware of the importance of communicating our science to the broader public and decision makers. I'll return to that theme throughout of communication in my own work in the example of what NPRB encourages its submissions in response to the RFPs to include, and some other examples. So from my perspective, when I think 2007 as an international law professor, I think of none other than Artur Chilangarov of the Russian Geographical Society. So his stunt, and actually a great technical accomplishment, it wasn't so much science as technology that allowed him to plant the titanium flag on the seafloor at the North Pole, That was conducted during a 2007 Russian scientific cruise to map the extent of the Russian continental shelf. It was one of multiple cruises by Russian scientists conducted over many years and at great expense to build the scientific record that would undergird Russia's submission to a body created under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Some of you will know that every Arctic coastal state has been conducting similar cruises over many years, sometimes jointly into the same end, including the United States. But what many of you likely do not know is that earlier this month, so 10 years later, that commission indicated its acceptance of most of the points that Russia submitted to delineate the limits of its extended continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. And that was done with the discipline of marine geophysics, the disciplines of international law and diplomacy, and they combined to help reach that result. Others of you thinking of 2007, probably all of you, will think of the first dramatic sea ice minimum that year, which, by the way, is not unrelated to Chilingarov's ability to plant that flag. Of course, that minimum was eclipsed 5 years later, and this is the most recent image from the National Snow and Ice Data Center showing this year's sea ice minimum and where the 2007 minimum is not on there anymore because the 2012 was so much lower. Those of you in fishery research might think of the 2009 creation of the Federal Arctic Fishery Management Area in the United States and its temporary closure to commercial fishing until more was known about the science of what stocks, if any, were moving north in commercially viable quantities. Or, if you work with Alaska Native colleagues and communities, you might point to the increased awareness in the scientific world over the past decade of indigenous or local and traditional knowledge as a complementary and critical source of information needed to understand the rapidly changing Arctic. I would go so far as to posit that from my discipline, second only to the dramatic loss of sea ice since 2007, is the move toward co-production of knowledge with Alaska Native colleagues, and that's the most significant change in the world of Arctic research over the last decade. The release of the Inuit Circumpolar Council Technical Report for Food Security, from which you see the image that they have used to describe an Alaskan Inuit Arctic ecosystem, that combined with the closing declaration of the Arctic Observing Summit in 2016 are just two ways that that change is manifest. And this is just a short quotation from the 7 major recommendations that Observing Summit made, and this is the first: to develop international principles and protocols that establish ethical guidelines for research for the involvement of Arctic indigenous knowledge holders, the use of indigenous knowledge, and the co-production of knowledge. So, and you can also find similar statements in, for example, the ICARP Decadal Report of 2016. So these are just a few examples, more viewed from the social science perspective of changes over the decade, and maybe in the discussion period we can have time to talk a little bit more about ones you would point to. So I'm going to return briefly to my own trajectory, and it's fair to say that 2007 was the year that changed my professional trajectory and in many ways led me to standing here before you as the director of a marine science funding agency in Alaska. Because it was in 2007 that I decided to step out of my familiar world and venture the 20-minute drive down Interstate 89 from Vermont Law School, where I taught law of the sea, to Dartmouth College, where someone I did not yet know, Lawson Brigham, was giving a talk on the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment at something called the Arctic Science Summit Week, which was not on my radar screen at all. And I name individuals in this narrative because it really is important who we meet in the course of doing more interdisciplinary work. At that time, I didn't care much about the Arctic, but I wanted to know more about the shipping assessment. Little did I know that I was about to enter the world of interdisciplinary science, with marine geophysicists as my guides. It was a marine geophysicist from UA Fairbanks, Dr. Bernie Coakley, who asked enough about my own work to know I needed to talk to Larry Mayer, who was mapping the continental shelf for the US efforts to demonstrate its extended shelf, as was Chilingarov. That led to an invitation to join Larry and the other scientists on the Healy for the next 2 mapping cruises, where I was immersed in a world very, very different from my own. Marine scientists are, for one, a lot more fun than lawyers, and their world is more collaborative, colorful, and three-dimensional. What we did share, though, was the Law of the Sea Convention. So that's a starting point for the more interdisciplinary and integrated research. I realized that they were working from the same treaty I'd been studying and teaching for years, but doing very different things with it. Those two cruises on Healy gave me enough of a layman's introduction to bathymetric mapping and basic geology, geomorphology, and geochemistry to be able to work at the State Department a few years later with scientists to put together a prototype of what US documentation for delineating the extended continental shelf could look like. Again, we couldn't have done the job if it was only geophysicists or only lawyers or only diplomats, but together we were able to. So how does this tie into science funding? It was there on those two cruises that I first appreciated the enormous investment our society pours into doing marine science. I'd never had to think about the cost of ship time, not to mention work involved in funding PIs, grad students, equipment, data processing and synthesis, workshops, conferences, etc. Most law professors still have never had to apply for a large grant from NSF or otherwise because most are salaried to teach and research. It's a true luxury, and that's changing some as well. But a few aspects of the Arctic Science Summit Week meeting are very relevant to the discussions of funding for marine science and how we promote integrated research. First, NSF was the driving financial force behind that meeting, substantial millions of dollars. And Dartmouth and Krell were the hosts, and ASSW would simply not take place without those NSF funds and academic and other institutional involvement, or by their counterparts when it's hosted outside of the United States, as it often is. As to interdisciplinary work, my entrance into that world was very much random and by chance, and I think the marine science enterprise as a whole has done better since then of promoting access to interdisciplinary opportunities through workshops, publications, and other efforts. But still many members of our community are trying to figure out how to do interdisciplinary and how to do integrated research and how to do it better. So what marine science funding agencies can do is help provide a structure and an arena in which integrated work and science communication can thrive and strengthen. NPRB's communication and outreach program and its integrated ecosystem research programs are one example to which I'll now turn. So we fast forward from 2007 to 2017. Over that decade, I've been privileged to collaborate with marine scientists on AGU posters, journal publications, and policy work, and to work with experts from the Alaska Native community and the Arctic Council on a range of law and policy issues involving Alaska's marine resources, both living and non-living. So for the last 10 months, my first on the job, I've been first 10 on the job as executive director, I've been there at the North Pacific Research Board. And that's where I'll focus the remainder of my comments. I'll talk about how developments in NPRB's programs and goals both reflect and shape the marine research landscape in Alaskan waters. So at NPRB, I'm honored to work with a 20-member board and a small staff of marine scientists and others to recommend research to the Department of Commerce that improves understanding of the marine waters around Alaska, their fisheries, and their ecosystems. NPRB staff include a PhD fisheries biologist and a PhD marine mammal physiologist who were active in their own field research programs, applied for many NSF and other grants, and still teach and otherwise engage in the scientific enterprise, as well as other science and communications and outreach and program support specialists. So NPRB was created by Congress in 1997, so 20 years ago, and began funding research in 2002. It takes that long to get a funding agency up and running, figure out the processes, the procedures, et cetera. So in those 15 years of funding, it has funded over $106 million in marine research in the North Pacific, which is defined as the large marine ecosystems of the Gulf of Alaska, the Bering Sea, and the Arctic Ocean. We passed the 100 million mark just last year, and that was cause for great celebration. How are we funded? So there was a lawsuit between the state of Alaska and the federal government about who had rights to some oil-rich barrier islands near Prudhoe Bay. The state was not successful, and funds were established under the same piece of legislation that established the North Pacific Research Board. And we received 20% of the interest on that fund, which is known as the Environmental Improvement Restoration Fund. So we are fortunate in that it is not an appropriations-based source of funding, so that gives us a bit more reliability. And one of our goals is to remain a reliable, steady source of funding for the marine research community working in the North Pacific. The legislation also sets up a 20-member board with broad representation. And this gets to the question of how are research questions shaped? Who decides what gets funded? And how do you get community input into that process? So one way is who sits on the funding agencies. And we have a wide range by law: the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Department of Interior, Department of Commerce, Alaska Sea Life Center, the Coast Guard, the Office of Naval Research, the State Department. And all of those groups have a very legitimate interest in what research gets done in the region. U.S. Arctic Research Commission is a key member, as is the Oil Spill Response Institute, set up after the Exxon Valdez disaster. And then the states. So Alaska has 5 seats, Washington 3, and Oregon 1. And that parallels the structure of the Fishery Council in the North Pacific. The Alaska seats represent fishery, Alaska Native interests, environmental, academic interests, and oil and gas. So those are all by law. So even the basics of how NPRB is structured reflect broad community involvement in shaping NPRB's science program. We also have scientific and advisory panels who provide significant input on developing RFPs and advising the board on funding decisions. So in the last 10 years, taking our decade, NPRB has become more interdisciplinary and has led the way in supporting integrated ecosystem research in the region and in supporting its researchers' efforts to communicate science to the communities they work with. And on the communication piece, so much so that as we've been making some changes and even more requirements for communications from researchers funded by us, board members involved in introducing those requirements a long time ago said, but you're moving away from what we're known for. And it was clear that in the end, this was a strengthening of those requirements that was broadly supported. So I'm going to talk about the core program and about our integrated ecosystem research programs. So the core program generally, those of you who picked up one of our biennial reports can get a lot more detail there. And for the audience online on the webinar, feel free to visit the website or to send me an email for any of the information you'd like links to. So although our funding is declining due to market forces and interest rates and not to other factors like appropriations, it is projected to hold steady at current levels or with slight increases into the foreseeable future. So what's traditionally been our core or annual program has targeted around $4.5 million. And in fact, in 2017, we funded $4.6 million because the Oil Spill Response Institute was able to put in an additional 100,000. The programs tend to run 1 to 5 years, and we're at the number you see there, over 650 projects. Any given time, about 90 of them are active. And so right there, just thinking of everything it takes to get to that point, you need program managers, and we were talking before the talk began about all of the unseen costs of marine science funding. And one is, whether it's at a large institution like NSF or a small one like NPRB, you need people to manage the programs and make sure things get done. You need people at the Department of Commerce to make sure that the funds keep coming on schedule and that you're complying with those requirements. So areas that we fund in this core program include fishes and invertebrates, oceanography and productivity, marine seabirds and mammals, human dimensions, and more recently focuses on technology development, data rescue, and cooperative research with industry. And those categories are not static. They change over time based on ideas, input we receive every year as we put together the RFP from the broader science community. And we do that in a couple of ways. We have online submissions and receive many good ideas that way. We have a solicited set of input from the agencies that deal regularly with our core mandate, which I realize I have failed to state explicitly, and that is to pursue pressing fishery management issues and ecosystem information needs in the North Pacific. So it's a mix of basic and applied science. And those inputs are then called by the panels, the science and advisory panels, and the board. And it's only a coincidence that our core call for proposals, the request for proposals, was published this last Monday on the 27th. So you can find that on the website. So I do want to take a minute, because in the conversations this last week here, both at the Search Steering Committee meeting and at the communications workshop, I heard over and over again, yes, we know we should be doing communications, but we don't really know how to do it. And this is from a group that's pretty actively engaged in that area. So if I can click us out of here and take you just for a moment to the NPRB website. There's the request for proposals. If you are looking for it, you just simply go to the second item under core program and you can find the RFP there. But I want to take you to the materials on communications and outreach. And even showing this to our own panels, they didn't realize this was all here. So we figured I need to communicate the communications information because we feel like it really is a good resource. So the NPRB outreach requirements are worth noting. So what we were noted for originally, and about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, is when we first started requiring every response, every funded proposal to spend at least $2,000 on some form of communications and outreach. We have since done away with or replaced that requirement, since most people were choosing to spend that on communications training, science communications training. There's now a requirement that one member of your project team attend the communicating science workshops that we offer every year at the Alaska Marine Science Symposium. So that will happen for every project funded. And on average, we fund about 25 to 28 projects a year. What's new this year, we're just beginning to fund the first round of companion outreach proposals. And the board has authorized up to $20,000 in addition to whatever you receive for your core program to develop a very robust set of communications programs. And this, so in the first round, involved maybe a curriculum for a high school course in the region that you're researching. Many, I can go into more detail in the question and answer session, but the fact that that amount of money is added to your award if you have a very strong outreach proposal indicates not just the board's interest, but the science advisory, or the science panel and the advisory panel, clear message that this is a critical part of what you do as marine scientists. But we can't just throw you out there. So just to point you to where you can go for more information, and to give you the sense of the range of resources out there, there are many links from other organizations that think about this, right? NPRB is not the only one doing it. So links to other resources, literature, there's really quite a bit of information there. So I won't spend any more time on that, but just want you to be able to poke around there at your leisure. So to return to the slides, I want to turn now to the integrated ecosystem research projects, and we've just launched the first cruises of the Arctic integrated program. There are materials outside that show the cruise plans over the 5 years of the active field season for the project. The Bering Sea project was generously supported by the National Science Foundation, and continues to receive excellent feedback from people using the science in management and for their own basic research. The Gulf of Alaska, just to give you an example of the kinds of results that come from integrated study as opposed to individual scientists sitting and looking only at productivity. So the Gulf of Alaska, for those of you familiar with its general shape, for many years, until quite recently, a couple of years ago, all of the groundfish stocks in the Gulf of Alaska were managed the same way. But scientists were beginning to notice differences in the basic oceanography and other factors affecting those stocks. And I don't have all of I did not put a slide up, but if you think about a line running through the middle of the Gulf of Alaska, and if you don't take account of the different oceanographic and other features of that large area of water, you miss a lot of changes that are, the information tends to flatten itself out because trends that you're seeing in the east are sort of balanced out by trends in the west, and nobody was really pulling those apart and seeing what was actually happening on either side of that divide. That research was, or that finding was possible because you had a range of scientists working different disciplines. And the North Pacific Fishery Management Council has, in fact, changed how it manages those stocks based on, in part, the research that came from the Gulf of Alaska Integrated Ecosystem Research Program. And we're still in the synthesis phase of that, which is part of each of the integrated programs. So there will be more results coming from there. But on the website, you can find much of the data from all the first two projects, and as it comes in from the third, that will become available as well. But I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the Arctic program because that's our shared interest here. And a reminder again that you can't really do this on your own, even for funding. So from BOEM and from the Collaborative Alaskan Arctic Studies Program, which was formerly a Shell North Slope Borough Cooperation, ONR, all providing funds, and then in kind from NOAA, UAF, and the National Science Foundation. So how do you get 27 principal investigators from 11 institutions to work together? I mean, this is the question that we get all the time. Great, you're funding us all, but does that mean we just go and sit in our silos? So on that first cruise that was out this summer, led by Seth Danielson, I want to say 8 of the PIs, maybe 9 of the PIs, were on that cruise working from a range of disciplines. The question everybody is trying to answer from their disciplinary perspective is up here for you on the screen. And think about this from your discipline, whether it's social science or natural science. How will reductions in Arctic sea ice, the big change in this decade, and the associated changes in the physical environment influence the flow of energy, think food chain, through the ecosystem in the Chukchi Sea? So depending on your discipline, you might look at transport or seasonal composition, distribution, and production of phytoplankton or particulate matter, zooplankton. You might think about the timing and magnitude and the fate of primary and secondary productivity, or the flux of energy between pelagic and benthic realms, or the distribution, the condition, and standing stocks of large crustacean zooplankton that serve as the prey base, right, for the upper trophic level fishes and seabirds. So no one scientist can answer all of those questions. And just one example of the first cruise that's out this summer is somebody was along who was also able to measure fluorescence, which basically gives you an indication of chlorophyll in the system. And they hadn't even anticipated that that would be part of what they would collect. And that's now added to the data set to give quite a bit of information. They were thrilled to land smack in the middle of the spring bloom. And one of the things that was value added about the second cruise is that they were measuring things at a time of year that there has not typically been much measurement. So that's just sort of from the disciplinary perspective, but what funding institutions can do is provide an infrastructure to make sure that all of that work is coordinated in a way that you get more value for the research dollar and that the scientists learn more. It's not glamorous, but we do things like an annual PI meeting. So pull those 27 PIs and their grad students together once a year to talk about where the project is. This started beforehand when they were coming up with that overarching question and their conceptual models, and it included the PIs from the human dimensions component, and that team is led by 2 social scientists, 2 indigenous knowledge holders, and works with a team of 9 representatives from villages in the Chukchi Sea area, and they're looking at issues of resilience in those communities. So everybody is sitting there around the table as they're refining their hypotheses and refining their research questions. There are logistics planning meetings prior to field season. And when I return in 2 weeks to back to Anchorage, there will be another of those planning meetings. There are monthly webinars for the research teams. And Danielle Dixon, who is our program manager for this Arctic IRP, I've never heard anybody talk about a conference call as where the magic happens, but this is how she characterizes what goes on those calls. Because it's, and we've learned this also in search with the regular monthly calls that some of the action teams are doing there. You get to know each other's work, you get excited about what you're able to do together. Something that many people aren't aware of is, so there are a lot of unfunded partners in this research. We call them an unglamorous name of Appendix A partners, but there are 22 existing federally funded research projects that have committed to collaboration. So much so that they pay their own way to these meetings of PIs. Right? You have access to the data, you have access to scientists who are working on shared interests. So that's just a sense of what I'll call the integration infrastructure that's required. And it requires most of Danielle's time and, of course, the time of all of the people involved in the project. So again, none of this is glamorous, but it is how you do better integrated work. I'm ahead of my own slides here. So I guess with that, let me just return to one other thing on communication in the Arctic IRP. And this gets to the, it's not yet co-production of knowledge, I would say, with our Indigenous colleagues and partners, but communication. And those are 2 very different things. And I think that's something the research community itself is only beginning to articulate well. But we do, that Arctic IRP program engages Alaska Native stakeholders at every stage. So hosted meetings in each of the regions where the cruises are taking place this year and in the next couple of years. Hub meetings where tribally nominated representatives show up and help talk about program design, and follow-up meetings to those regions will present the results of what's been learned on each of the cruises. Seth Danielson, who was the PI on the first cruise this summer, has already been back to some of the regional groups, met with the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, and unexpectedly, for example, the Sikuliaq was called away on a search and rescue, and their ability to do that was a great, it was greatly appreciated by the communities, and it is what you do and how you build relationships. The Arctic IRP project research questions itself address questions of interest to the communities, especially food security for Arctic residents. Presentations are made at the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, the Arctic Waterway Safety Committee, and many of the Alaska Native Marine Mammal Co-Management organizations. Results of that, for example, survey design was altered and the timing was altered based on feedback from those audiences so that the conflicts with subsistence activities would be avoided. And then things like daily communications from the vessel. Some of you, I think, are on our daily email that's coming out from Johanna Vollenweider right now saying, this is where we are, this is what we plan to do at the sampling stations, et cetera. So enough about communication from the Arctic IRP. And I guess what I would like to end with, to give us a little bit of time for discussion, is to go back to this communication workshop. So I see Jennifer Francis has walked in, and she was part of that workshop, and she's part of Search. And she was just at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I think that's the last of the whirlwind of activity that resulted from this communications workshop. So after receiving that training, many of us in the group have spent the week taking what we learned on the road. We did so Wednesday at a Senate briefing for staffers interested in the state of knowledge on Arctic environmental change, at a press conference at AAALS, and then this morning at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Other members of the action teams, so there are 3 action teams, one on sea ice, one on land ice, and one on permafrost. The land ice folks, I think, had set up 7 or 8 meetings with other congressional staffers to talk about sea level rise this week. So honing the messages that we have through that communications workshop. So I wanted to end with communication because this allows us, I think, to connect the science funding question that I advertised and haven't really dug into in depth, and turn now to a little bit more of a discussion. So at the communication workshop, we were each asked to take an issue and build it out, how we would present it. And I had chosen funding uncertainty for Arctic research. But the more I worked through the system that they gave us for deciding whether this is a problem, what the benefits, what the challenges are, the more I realized much, I will say all of the information that NPRB has received on the uncertainty regarding marine science funding for our region has been anecdotal. And we still need to gather a lot more information in a more systematic way, and I'm not sure which organization takes that on. But I do know that scientists have expressed concern about uncertainty. The state of Alaska is going through great financial challenges, and one of the comments from a colleague in an independent discussion was that students are beginning to think maybe they don't want to go to the university because they're not quite sure what the financial future is. So what we need to do, I think, as scientists is to communicate the value of our science to show that it is worth funding. And I think that's true regardless of the funding climate. And it's still, I think, too speculative to say that things are going to go one way or the other. But the more we can continue to fund the basic research that allows groups to synthesize it and present it to decision makers without policy recommendations, but simply say, this is what we know. This is the state of knowledge on Arctic environmental change, on sea level rise, on extreme weather, whatever the question you get, to be able to stand up and say, this is what we know. So maybe in the few remaining minutes, we have about 15, 20 minutes for discussion, hear your anecdotes and questions about that, but also generally just responses to what I've had to say to you today. Thanks for your attention. And I would be remiss if I did not put this information up there. We'll just leave that up during the discussion, so if you're interested in future ARCUS speakers, you can note that information.
Thanks very much, Betsy, and what a wonderful presentation. I want to remind everybody that we're open for questions from both the online audience and the in-person audience here. If you are in person, the important thing to know is that in order to speak, you need to press the button in front of your microphone in order to speak. That way you can be heard online. And for those of you online, you can type your questions into the chat box, and we will respond to them there. So who has the first question? Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Captain Eric Sauer, I work at NJ, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I have 2 questions. One is, the data that you collect there in the Arctic, or in that region, the North Pacific, is that readily available? And is it available real time or near real time?
It is not yet available real time. And that is something that we are working on for future projects. But as the scientists make it available to NPRB, it is put up on the website. But there's often a several-month lag there.
Okay, and the second question is, when you look at the vessels of opportunity to do the collection up there, you're aware that the oceanographic research fleet is dwindling. Is there any move within your organization to help facilitate bringing that back, or at least sustaining the current capability?
Not directly. So all of our funded research is through requests for proposals. So if we receive requests related to that, then we do fund it. I know it's not exactly the same question, but when you lose a source of data, you try to figure out how can you make up for it or maybe help continue it. So long-term monitoring is a very good example. So that would come to the North Pacific Research Board sort of case by case in the first 10 years of the program. And it was sort of lumped in with all the other requests. And eventually, in 2014, the board said we need to do this more systematically so that we can ensure that you continue those observations. And so commits $400,000 a year to 3 different long-term monitoring stations, one in each of those large marine ecosystems, the Seward Line being one of them. So I'd be interested to speak with you a bit more offline about ideas that you have on that. But you raise a really interesting problem that we hear from our fisheries colleagues in the state and at the federal level is what if their funding constraints prevent them from doing their basic survey or assessment work? And does that then become a pressing fishery management need, which is our legislative mandate? Right, so those are the types of questions that we're hearing from the community and not giving just a quick answer, but really thinking about how we can be responsive in similar kinds of situations.
Thank you.
So we have a question online here from Adrian. It says, over the past 10 years, the oil and gas industry funded several interdisciplinary multi-year oceanographic studies to the tune of over $10 million. Those programs and their funding ended in 2014. How can we possibly make up for that loss of funding?
An excellent question, and one that we hear often. It's difficult. You can't do it at that scale. And that, I think, is perhaps the biggest gap. But as you may have noted in the funding partners for the Arctic Integrated Research Program, one thing NPRB explored is, may we receive funds other than the grant funds that we get from NOAA? And in fact, have been able to do that with the assistance of NOAA and can pull in monies from other organizations. But that remains the very big elephant in the room. And there just won't be as much marine science done in the Arctic as a result of that, at least for the short term.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Yeah, over there.
Also Kun from the Norwegian Embassy. I'm wondering how do you go about international cooperation? I'm thinking both at a more strategic level and more operational at the project level.
So we are able to go about international cooperation because our legislation, our establishing legislation specifies that we can fund international research as well as domestic research. So operationally, I guess to answer that first, on Seth's cruise on the Sikuliaq this year, there were 2 colleagues from Russian research institutes. Our science director, Matt Baker, has just been at the Vladivostok meeting in Pisces and has been working with colleagues there for several years now on data exchange. So trying to keep going through the scientific cooperation field, work that might otherwise not be accomplished at the diplomatic level. Institutionally, we are in the process of looking at which entities we might be able to partner with. It's not something that we've had to do beyond the types of organizations that you saw listed as co-funders for the integrated programs. And that allows me to bring up a word everybody's talking about, but I didn't mention, is so how do you leverage what is out there and being done? So NPRB is interested in finding partners, not to have more money for NPRB, but so that we can pass it on in a collective way to a bigger research project. So whether something could be done with analogs between the Norwegian and Alaskan fishing areas is certainly open to discussion. Some of that could happen on just a straight RFP submission to the core program. A more long-term planning for a larger effort would involve several years. And I guess I should state that as well. So Right now, the board this year is funding only the core program, but is committed down the road to setting aside the appropriate amount of funds for another integrated program should the right idea come along. Right now, we're still in the middle of our Arctic program.
Great. So a question online from Cynthia. You talked about co-production earlier. Are any of the co-produced materials out in the literature or available to be shared?
Thank you for the question. I should be more clear. At this point, we don't have any co-produced materials. There are specific calls for submissions on co-production of knowledge in this year's RFP, and there were last year. But this is a fairly new area for us to have specified. And as far as the work being done on the Arctic Integrated Program, what I maybe could make more clear is that we're just in the first year of the field work. So at this point, there's nothing to share, but I'd be glad to communicate with you by email if you have some more questions on any of this.
And I might just comment that there are actually quite a few examples of successful co-production of knowledge that are available, many of them linked from the ARCIS website that you can take a look at as well, from all different types of groups. Any other questions in the room here? Yes.
Hi, I'm Bernadette Engelstead. I'm a research collaborator with the Smithsonian's Arctic Study Center, and I'm interested in the manner in which you speak about collaboration with communities. I wonder how you recruit members of the North Pacific Research Board and Indigenous members, if you hold meetings in the communities throughout Alaska, and how much your breadth of participation would include Canadian Indigenous groups in the Yukon and in British Columbia.
Thank you for the question. I can answer the second one more quickly. To my knowledge, there has not been formal participation with Canadian colleagues from First Nations and other Indigenous peoples. On the first question of how NPRB, I won't say engages with, because Alaska Native representation is mandated by law. So at this point, that one seat on the board is filled by somebody who works very closely with IPCOM, the Indigenous Peoples Co-Management Marine Mammals Organization, Commission for Marine Mammals. And on our advisory panel, there's no formal requirement, but it usually works out that of the 12 members, about a third are representative of subsistence fishing interests, other, so the Bristol Bay Native Association is one seat currently. So that just happens by nomination and word of mouth, and a concerted effort to recruit representatives from across the range of stakeholders. A little bit more detail on the hub meetings that we have held in connection with the Arctic Integrated Research Program is that, for example, in the Nome region, we worked very closely with Queric, and we contracted with them for them to identify who they felt were the appropriate representatives from each of the villages, the tribal representation. And so it was not our choice. We're not expert in that, but relied on the local experts to tell us who should be there to talk with our PIs before they started out on their field work this summer. So those are just some examples. Does that begin to address your
Yes,
question?
thank you. But the question with regard to holding meetings in communities in which information and communication could occur within a broader
I should make clear that those hub meetings aren't in the individual villages. It becomes a matter of cost. But so the hubs were Barrow, Nome, and Kotzebue, and representatives from 10 to 12 of the villages in each of those regions came in. Some of the PIs make it a priority, and we encourage them to also spend time in the villages, and that's part of the submissions that we received for that proposal, so that beyond those hub meetings, they are going into the schools in some instances, into the communities, and reporting both before and after their work, their field seasons.
So I had a question about what do you think are the most important things that are sort of the infrastructure to accomplish collaborative, integrative research? If you had to list 2 or 3 of them and say these are the most important factors that'll help different research groups work together across different boundaries.
I'd say consistency and structure. It doesn't need to be a monthly PI call with all 27 PIs, but that's what it has worked out to be for this project, and people are on that call. They are on that call. Then the lead PIs, there are 4 for that particular program. They meet even more regularly, both with calls that Danielle organizes or on their own. So consistency, enough funding, right? You can't ask people to do all of that work without paying them for their time. So those 2, and I would say whatever forum, as you begin to work together, that you learn generates enthusiasm and excitement for the work being done, and that will depend on the project itself.
Great. Great. So maybe we can wrap up with this last comment here from James Robinson. It says he's from Alaska,
Right.
and just to say that the interaction and communication of modern science and traditional knowledge users and back is really appreciated in the communities. So thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for your interest.
Unless there are any other questions in here, I will wrap up. Just to wrap up, first of all, I wanted to thank Betsy for a really interesting discussion today and let you know that there are many more seminars coming down the pike here in the Arctic ARCIS Research Seminar Series. October 4th, which is next week, we are going to be hosting Peter Pulsifer from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. I encourage you to sign up for that. You can sign up online at arcis.org. We also have Courtney Carruthers and Laura Zanotti, who are going to be coming in November, and Roberto Delgado and Andrea Horvath coming in February. And you can check out all the information on the website. Encourage you to consider becoming an ARCIS member. We're really delighted that you came out to participate today, and please do let me know if there are other things that we can do to help support the Arctic research community and making connections across boundaries. And hope everybody has a great day, both here in DC and online. Thanks for coming.